There we are.
Okay, thank you. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Is there any public comment?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If you are online, if you will use the raise hand feature, we will have you give the opportunity to speak with the board one at a time. If you are in the ICN room and wish to speak, you'll need to come over to the state board room and we will address that then. I have Katie Grevin and she will be allowed to talk momentarily.
Go ahead and read it now.
Okay, before we start with a public comment, I would just like to make a brief statement. The state board's agenda is full, and I may place limits on public comment based on the number of members of the public who intend to speak. I will give each speaker 5 minutes or 3 minutes if they're a large number. So we'll see how many people there are. And if there's a large number, then I'll limit it to 3. When your time is allotted, I will ask you to conclude, and the board will move on to the next speaker. The department will not respond to public comment aside from requesting clarification. And the department may place a topic raised in public comment on a future agenda. A topic from public comment that is not related to an item on today's agenda will not be addressed at today's meeting. Thank you. Katie?
Yes, can you hear
Okay.
me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person to comment today. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to make comments, and I'm here to follow up on the remarks I made in January about the Iowa Dyslexia Task Force recommendations. I want to thank all of you for placing this topic on your agenda today. We were very pleased to see that and are looking forward to hearing more about that discussion. I did want to share a few comments before you get to that place in the agenda on the update document that has been provided by the Iowa Department of Education. And if you do want to follow along, I believe that is tab E in your materials. And I just wanted to share a few things in general about that document. Again, you know, I'm very pleased to see that there's something in writing that we're using to discuss this issue and follow along with what needs to be done. As a refresher, the Dyslexia Task Force issued its report in November of 2019. Some of the requirements were legislated in law. Some were recommendations for stakeholder groups. And in looking at this document, a couple of clarifications. This is the first written document regarding dyslexia that our organization has seen from the Department of Education in 2 years. And all of those legislated requirements that indicate they are on track or met, that is all technically true. I did want to let the board know that those deadlines were actually in 2021 and 2022. The legislators pushed them back at the very last minute before passing the bill due to COVID and not knowing what was to come. And I think wanting to give people some grace on that. But those deadlines were not meant to be a mandate not to do anything with dyslexia for 2 years. So I think many of them can easily be done or could have been done by now. And I just wanted to clarify that was the reason those were put in there. Most of them do not take that long. There is a small technical error in legislative requirement number 1. The endorsement candidates will not graduate until December 2022. In looking at the bottom of that document where we talk about the recommendations for the task force, that's really what I came to talk about last month and now, not the legislative requirements. The task force decided to put the most important recommendations in code. And in the very room you are sitting, I participated in many task force meetings, and looking at those recommendations for the department, we actually considered putting quite a few of them in code, and were told by the department representatives at the time that that would not be necessary because they would be done very promptly and willingly. And there just wasn't a need. So why bother putting them in a law when the organization was happy to go ahead and do them very promptly? So when you look at bullet point number 3, where it says, Many of these items are not legislated. The department will need to decide which are a priority and which may be outside of their obligations. I wanted to share how troubling and disappointing that is. I'm often asked as a representative of Decoding Dyslexia Iowa, why do you all go after legislation? And the answer is to hold people accountable, because we have had so many experiences that unless we put them in law and babysit it all the way, it simply doesn't get done. So, again, it's a little disturbing to hear that now we're thinking about maybe we don't have to do these, because the task force did in fact think they were pretty important to do. And I'm hoping that as you all review them, you'll agree. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the role of the Dyslexia Board in implementing these. You will see that a lot of some reasoning here for not doing some of the recommendations was we need to collaborate with the Dyslexia Board. And I think that's a valid point. I personally called the governor's office and the Department of Education office once a month, sometimes twice a month, for about 15 months, asking about when the board would be established. And it took almost a year and a half after the legislation passed to get the board established. We have met twice, and our last meeting was almost 5 months ago. And I think the board members are very happy to collaborate with the department on all of these things, but I do think that the board is a volunteer group of citizens, and we are expecting the work product to come from the department to be brought to us for feedback. It would not be appropriate for the board to be doing a lot of that work. And in looking at the upcoming dyslexia board agenda, it appears that that might be kind of the plan. So many of the recommendations on there require the department to draft documents, to put together frameworks. And I think the board is looking forward to seeing those and hopes to see some soon. We are really
We're at
grateful.
5 minutes, so I'm going to have to tell you to, could you please wrap it up?
Okay. Well, again, I want to thank you for your time in putting this on the agenda, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have either during the meeting or outside of the meeting. So anyone from the department or the board, if you want to reach out, please feel free. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. David, do we have anyone else on the line?
I do not have anyone else online at this time. I do have one phone number, and I just want to give them the opportunity. If you do want to speak, it is *9 on your phone, and that will raise your hand. There are no other requests to speak with board.
Thank you, David. All right, we'll move on to the director's report.
Okay, well, thank you. We have a very full agenda, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into too many details because a lot of it's going to be covered throughout the day, but just thank you for those who continue to check their emails regularly. We do send out a lot of important updates. A lot of that information is covered every week. The department does a lot of work. So we appreciate the opportunity to keep all of you on that. Just as a note too, sometimes information is more as an FYI and not something we're expecting you to participate in. So if you ever have questions, please let us know, but we really want to make sure the board is aware of our work. There was a question specific to an update on the teacher retention bonuses. The timing of the meeting makes that conversation a little bit difficult because information was just due back to the department this week. So we're receiving information from the districts. Some districts have already sent their payments out though, however. So I think we'll have more information for you in future updates in a sense on how that is proceeding. But it really, the timelines kind of hit at the same point right now. You have all been copied on all the information that was sent on all that. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And then one of the big things we're going to keep talking about going forward, and one of the things I've been using as a focus on some of my visits is how we can really take everything we've learned in the past couple of years and rethink how we do education. So I've been able to go on a lot of different visits to just a variety of groups, anything from the Hy-Vee Innovation Center to the Iowa State Center to visiting with student groups, AEAs listening to superintendents. I'm hearing common messages on how we all want to kind of think a little bit differently. So in the future, you're going to be getting some more information about how we're going to convene some working groups to get some feedback and really have some big conversations about what we can do differently. But I have found that people are very open and very honest, and that's been really meaningful in terms of my ability to get some feedback from the field. So that is one of the things that I will continue to make a priority and keep all of you looped in on as well. We did participate in a meeting legislatively on just review of some of our rules. We will continue to do that as part of our rethinking things that kind of got left in statute that we typically review every 5 years anyway, and anything that might be something that needs to be reconsidered going forward. So we have a good kind of process in place for that. We've already started some of those conversations, so I think there's some real opportunity to make some big changes. The last thing then is we do have a board member who actually was appointed and would be here today, Nathan Peterson, but he was not able to attend. So he is official as of now. So he has received the information, but he was not able to be here. So I will save his introduction for him for the next time, but I'm grateful to have a full board that we'll have going forward. Yes. Any questions?
Where's he from generally?
He's from Iowa City, but he went to school in Des Moines. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, legislative update. Great.
Good morning.
Morning.
So, I don't remember when you last met, but it was right at the outset of everything. And I was like, still like 5 days fresh into this position. So I kind of stumbled through the first update, and maybe I'll be more coherent this time around and be able to tell you what's happening over there. Procedurally, calendar wise, where they're at across the street is past the second funnel. So each legislative session, there's 2 procedural deadlines known as the funnel, and those basically just serve to narrow the focus of the legislature around bills that have momentum and are more likely to pass than others. So now that we're past the second funnel, the expectation is that bills that were introduced in the House are out of House and out of a Senate committee and vice versa. They're well on their way to being done for the year, actually. And following second session, the second funnel, just a couple of bills that I think are worth noting that we're still monitoring that still have the possibility of moving this year, in addition to those that were already signed by the governor. So 2 relate to just general funding. You likely saw the governor already signed the 2.5% increase to allowable growth for next year. That was set a month or so ago. The other one that was just introduced is the education appropriations bill, which includes funding for many programs, but including the department's general operating budget, which was level funded. It includes the Iowa Skilled Worker and Job Creation Fund program, so the Workforce Training and Economic Development Fund, the Pathways for Academic, Career, and Employment Program, PACE, GAP. A lot of the funds those flow to our community colleges. It's around $30 million in funding. Those were all level funded for this year as well. And it also includes the community college state general aid, which flows through the department to the colleges, and the House proposed a $6.5 million increase for the community colleges, which would give them about $221 million total for next year if that passes. Other things that we're watching would be the governor's proposals. So there's actually 4 versions of those bills, the governor's proposals going through now, 1 in the Senate that matches what she introduced at the beginning of the year, and 3 in the House. 1 is the original governor's bill that was introduced, and then there's 2 bills that basically split the bill and removed the scholarship provision. All those are still alive after the second funnel. They were referred to either the appropriations committees or the Ways and Means committees, which allows them to go through the funnels without having to meet the other procedural hurdles. So we are continuing to monitor the progress of those bills over the next couple of weeks. And then there was another governor's bill that was more related to workforce programs. But our interest in that bill, House File 2569, relates to a few provisions that are focused on work-based learning and individual career and academic planning for students. With the ICAP, it calls for integrating work-based learning and FAFSA completion into the planning process. The school district wouldn't be expected to make sure every student completes the FAFSA, but they would have to inform students of what's involved with completing the FAFSA, so they're prepared to complete it. And it also gives the department more authority to collect data around work-based learning, so we have a better picture of what's happening at school districts and what opportunities are available to students. There's a couple of bills making changes to the Future Ready Iowa Last Dollar Scholarship Program, including one that would allow part-time students to be eligible for accessing the scholarship. And there is also one that relates to the high demand jobs that are identified as part of that program. It provides a little bit more flexibility for community colleges in selecting those jobs. There's a couple that impact the department, including two that call for the department to convene task force during the interim. One would be focused on reviewing all healthcare related mandatory trainings for school districts and school personnel. And the second would focus on the delivery of special education services to students attending non-public schools. Lastly, there's several bills that are moving around teacher recruitment, retention, licensure. Larry's here, thank God, because he can talk about these things far better than I can. So do you want to talk about those bills quickly?
Sure. So there's basically three bills to concern about. One is House File 2500 that would allow a private organization basically to make teachers, and you wouldn't have any control over it. And that bill we think is dead. There's a bill that will codify our intern programs. We have our intern programs under Chapter 77, and this would put them in, they're not in code. We just use the code that's there now. This will put them in code and reduce the number of credits that are required for the intern programs. And then the big one is House File 2081, which does away completely with the program completion test. Right now, since Senate File 2284 was passed in 2012, in order to complete a teacher prep program, you must pass a test of content and pedagogy. And there's a bill that's gone through the House unanimously and has gone through Senate Ed unanimously to just do away with the testing requirement altogether. It also requires that any of the programs that have had people that didn't pass over these years since we started testing, they have to notify those people and work with them to see if they want to move forward. They would still have to meet the requirements in place now. So if somebody didn't pass in January 2013 and walked away and now wanted to come back, they don't, they passed their test in essence, but any requirements for the program that have changed since then, they would have to meet those. So they have to meet the current requirements. But that could mean 400 to 500 people that we're going to reach out for that could potentially get their teaching license. There's a few other ones. There's a couple that make some changes to the Board of Education, the Board of Educational Examiners and their makeup and things like that, but those aren't ours.
So it's a danger to speculate about legislation, but what do you think about 2081? What are the chances of that?
Well, so actually when testing went in place in the 2012 legislature, beginning in 2014, they've been chipping away at it. And when it was first passed, there was a test to get into the program and a test to get out. 2 years ago, they did away with the test to get into the program. They left the language in the code, but said it's voluntary. There was a bill, not last year. Last year was just, was completely different. But the year before, there was a similar bill to do away with the testing, and it got some traction, but didn't go very far. But this passed the House unanimously on the floor. So I've never seen that happen. And it passed the Senate Ed again unanimously, bipartisan. So the chances of it passing are, let me put it this way, the chances of it passing the legislature are pretty good. Obviously the governor would still have the final say.
Thank you.
Was it? And you had the opportunity, Ryan had the opportunity to address high need areas. Isn't that correct? Even beyond the testing, the 20%. You had the power to say, we're going to waive that requirement. Is that not correct?
Not that requirement, no.
Okay.
I think they're, and Larry, go ahead, Larry.
So as a compromise 2 years ago, what the legislature passed was that the director shall give a waiver to anyone who asks for it, for them to get a 1-year temporary license while they're trying to pass the test. It's a 1-year temporary license that is absolutely not renewable. And so that allowed them a year to pass the test. Some people that worked, some people it didn't. But if the test goes away, that goes away. But the test, our code says that anything that you establish in rules cannot be waived, with the exception of that one waiver.
Thank you. Larry's been my co-conspirator over there. So covering, yeah, we're even matching shoes now, I guess.
Oh, geez.
So he's been spending way too much time.
My goodness, that's hilarious.
He's been covering a lot of the teacher prep topics, and most importantly, covering 5:30 subcommittees when I'm at home having to feed my kids because they turn into nightmares if they don't get fed. So yeah, I really appreciate everything he's doing and helping out. So yeah, with that, we are past the second funnel. They've been moving pretty quickly and pretty efficiently this year, and it's my first year, so I don't have anything to compare it to. But Shan's jaw drops a lot when I talk to her about what's happening over there, because she hasn't seen anything like the speed and the efficiency that they're working. Right? Is that fair to say? Yeah. So we've heard rumors that they would like to not come back after Easter, which is 3 weeks out. That'd be remarkable, right? We'll see if that comes true. They have a lot to cover in the next couple of weeks, if that's true. But any questions on what's happening?
I have a question. Could you explain? Yeah, I'm on the other screen. Could you explain a little bit about the bill that would detail like special education requirements for non-public schools? Is that allowing public schools to provide that special education support, or how does that work?
Yeah, so that's a very detailed question. I can tell you the history of that bill. The bill in its original format called directly for the delivery of special education services on the non-public school premises. And that bill has a history. It wasn't introduced for the first time this session. It was introduced, I believe, several times before. But our legal counsel consultants at the department had conversations about how it's not a clean conversation. And so basically they amended it in committee to call for the task force to review the topic and to make recommendations about how to serve those students.
Okay, because I thought that I had seen a bill earlier in the legislative session talking about it would require or it would allow special education students to dual enroll at a non-public school and a public school to receive those supports from a public school while receiving private education. Is that a bill that's in the session right now?
They currently can. So special education students with this who are enrolled in a non-public school are entitled to public school service, special education services in the same manner and to the same extent as public school students. The question of this bill was the location of those services, the non-public school campus or the public school campus. And as Eric said, that's not a clean line about where and when those services should be provided. Question about whether or not one size fits all fits. So that's the purpose of the study committee, to basically spell out the location of those services that Iowa law has required to be provided since the mid-90s. It's a question of location, not whether.
So, okay, that helps a lot. Thank you. So this bill is just a task force having a conversation about it. It doesn't put into law like the public schools would need to send teachers over to the private schools. It's just them trying to figure out what to do. Okay.
Yep, that's correct. Yep. Okay. Well, thank you.
I want to thank everybody who's been involved with the legislative process. I think many of you that follow recognize we're monitoring well over 200 bills throughout this process, and the team that we have in place and their expertise has been tremendous to try to cover this. So that sounds real simple when they stand up there and talk. There's a whole lot behind that. So I appreciate everybody who's part of that and the work that they have to do, because it's important to be on top of bills and be able to offer feedback and language as this process moves forward. And the main thing too, we always have to remember is until it is final and signed, we don't know what the final language is. And that could change a lot of things. So a lot of what we're talking about is current state of where things live. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to the consent agenda. Can I get a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
I will second.
All right, it's been moved and second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the motion carries. Fiscal year 2022-2023 annual budget approvals for area education.
Good morning. My name is Denise Regis, and I'm an education program consultant here at the department. I collect, review, and compile the information from the AEAs and compile this report for you. The first couple of pages are pretty self-explanatory. I thought we would just move to the first page of data, the table. It's the resources. So this is the revenue side of what the AEAs have budgeted for fiscal year 23. So you have the information by AEA in large categories. One thing you should keep in mind is at the time that they had to prepare this budget, they had to use the law that was currently in effect. And so that was at 0%. They did not know there was a 2.5% increase at that time. And also the other thing to keep in mind is that there almost always, at least for the last decade or more, there usually is an additional cut to the AEA budgets at the very last moment of a legislative season when they're putting the appropriations together. So that is forthcoming, but they could not portray those cuts at this time because, of course, they didn't know what they would be. So that's the resources page. The next page is just a pie chart to give you a visual. The page after that is the expenditures, and it's just by large categories also, the function category, again, by AEAs. And of course, the bottom part of the page just shows the percentage of that category to the total. And a pie chart. Then you come to the 3-year comparison. And that's always an interesting page because it shows the revenues and the expenditures portrayed for three years. The actual of the past year, fiscal year 21, the current year, fiscal year 22, and what the districts have re-estimated, or the AEAs have re-estimated at this time, and then their proposed budget for fiscal year 23. There is a little bit of additional money to them through the federal government this year. I don't believe they had anything come to them through ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, but for ESSER 3, they did receive about 25 million, rough numbers, 25 million-ish. About 21 million is going to stay with them. 3 million got passed on to the districts, the districts in the state. In addition to the 24 million that normally is passed to the districts for IDEA federal grant funds, which is the special ed funding. The information I received was they probably will not be spending all 21 million of the dollars, and so the revenue cannot be recognized in this current fiscal year, but they have fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23 to spend that additional funding. And the very last page, we started giving you a couple of years ago, additional information just about the fund balance comparison for the last several years and for each AEA. Because we did have an AE that was struggling. They had a negative fund balance. And as you can see, everyone's in the black, which is a, fantastic thing. The struggling AEA has come up each year. So it looks like everyone's kind of holding their own at this point in time, so. Does anyone have any questions for me?
Do community colleges have a public hearing for their proposed budgets?
Yes, they do have a public hearing, just like the school district. And they probably do that public hearing. I think most of them probably do it in January. So, they don't have that other additional information. Yeah.
They're guesstimating.
Yeah, it's due to us on February 10th, so they've got to get it done.
I did notice that they're all in the black and their trends, especially that last chart helps a lot. The
Good.
chart helps a lot.
I have a process question. It's probably something I should already know. Do the AEAs separately do zero-based budgeting and this is the aggregation of that? Or is there some reverse flow of that? Is there something done at the aggregate that gets passed down to them?
I'm not sure I understand.
Does each AEA do its own budget like a school district?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so this is just
We are aggregating
some,
you.
right?
Yes.
Okay.
The resources and expenditures are by individual, but then that 3-year comparison, we've just done that in the aggregate.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Is there anything in particular that the board should look at in terms of evaluating these numbers? Whether they're good, they're bad, or there's concern?
I think the fund balance comparison is the one that is the most helpful for concern. If you see an AEA that is continually dropping, and I mean, we got into the position that the AEA that did have difficulty, it actually was budgeting at 0 fund balance for the future and then became a negative fund balance. That's a huge red flag, but we don't want to get to that point, Other than that, I'm not sure that there is.
Thank you.
Any more questions? All right. Thank you, Denise.
I would move that we approve the AA budgets for fiscal year 2022, 2023.
It's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 All right, the motion carries. All right, dyslexia task force recommendation.
All right, I had a request to close the door.
Oh.
David asked me to close it for the Zoom cameras.
Oh. Except the sound.
Oh.
And then it moves the camera.
Oh, okay. Jeez.
All right, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good morning, Brad. I am going to, David was going to get me switched to panelist so I could project some slides to
Brad,
that.
Brad, I'm sorry, something is going wrong here and it will not let me do it.
I think it just went.
Ah, perfect.
All right.
It's nice not to have people up there. Oh, but I said I spoke too soon.
All right, very good. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about the work the department's been doing related to the dyslexia task force's recommendations from 2019. I believe you've got this in different form, but I do have copies of those recommendations in hard copy here. If you don't have your eyes on it, you can have your eyes on those recommendations here, Brian. So as that's circulating, I've had the good opportunity to speak with you before, and we've met. I'm a bureau chief here at the Department of Education. Work around dyslexia moved into my portfolio late last spring. If you recall, David Tilley, our previous deputy director, was running the dyslexia work prior to me. So when he retired, that shifted to me. So in this specific context, then I'm actually Director Lebo's designee to the dyslexia board and was elected chair of the board at the first board meeting in September. So context, that's why I'm here talking to you today. Wanted to give you an update on the work that we've been doing here. I also have my colleague Kathy Birch here. She's an administrative consultant at the Department of Education. Provided staff support to the task force originally, provides staff support to the board now. And we both bring a similar background to this as school psychologists and having worked around assessment and intervention for students with dyslexia. So Kathy's here too, and we'll jump in if I miss anything and can help answer questions as well. So what we want to talk about a little bit, like I always try to do when we're talking together, is talk about the alignment with your priorities and goals and how this work fits there. I want to talk a little bit about progress on the code related to the recommendations, progress that we've been making on things that aren't in code, but in those task force recommendations as well, and talk about next steps. So I've got some slides here and I can talk through some of these, but also you've got the one-page summary highlight that Katie was discussing earlier. I appreciate Katie's comments and am happy to address any questions that you have as we go here too. So I've got slides, but don't necessarily have to get through all of them. They're just there to help our conversation. So alignment with your priority and goal statements. This seems to fit most tightly with eliminating achievement and opportunity gaps, and in particular, the goal around making sure all learners have access to personalized student-centered learning opportunities and differentiation interventions, et cetera. But there's also a connection with making sure teachers have got access to training and professional learning and supports as well. In this case, focused on the teaching of students with dyslexia. So this seems to fit really nicely with that priority and goal, those set of goals that you have as a board. So what I've got in the next several slides are really just a summary of the one-page document that probably has some more detail than I've got on the slides. But just to run down some of this, the task force report had 5 recommendations to the legislature and 9 to the Department of Education. And so all 5 of the recommendations to the legislature and 1 to the department were passed into law. And so that's part of our context here, right? Is there are things in the task force recommendations that weren't put into law. As Katie noted in her public comments, the conversations earlier was we can move on these recommendations without them being put into law. And I will note, and it happens with a lot of the things that we talk about here, the pandemic certainly had an impact on the pace of starting to move on some of these things, which was, I think, recognized by the legislature by extending some of the deadlines from the original proposals that were put forth in bills. So I will note we're on track with everything that's in code. Things that we've gotten done to date. We revised the rules to address a change in the dyslexia definition. There's a change in code, so we made sure the rules reflected that. We're on track with the specialist endorsement with the Iowa Reading and Research Center at the University of Iowa. That program's up and running, and the first cohort has started. So they're moving down the road with that. We actually provided funding to AEAs. So is there in code, part of what's required for them is to have at least 1 staff person focused on dyslexia, and their staff have got to take over a few modules as well. So we actually provided funding to each AEA so they could have at least one of their staff members be part of that specialist program. And that's 8 of the 9 AEAs started that this school year in terms of being able to engage with us and the funding for it. And the 9th one will be in short order here once the next cohort gets going. So we supported the IRRC, Iowa Reading Research Center, in their work. And we're working to hire a dyslexia consultant, which is part of what's in code for us to do by 2024. We've actually tried twice already to do that. The first time we didn't have a sufficient applicant pool. There just wasn't a good match given who applied. We ran it again and it ran right into the beginning of the pandemic. And at the time, we were unsure how that was the pandemic and was going to affect tax revenues and therefore budgets. And so to make sure that we didn't end up having to riff our own staff, we paused hiring new staff that we're going to require state funding. We don't get funding for this requirement. So we're charged to have it, but there's no funding that comes along with it. So to make sure that we didn't end up having to riff our own staff, we paused the hiring on that position until we had a better understanding of what the revenues would look like to fund it. So we're actually getting that going now. And we also want to make sure we're consulting with the dyslexia board on the job description so we can get their input on that as well. As noted, we've met with the board twice already. We got their first legislative report submitted on time. And we are slotted again to meet here, hopefully at the end of March 30th. We had resignation on the board. And as I think you can appreciate as a board, if you don't have quorum, you can't conduct your business, right? So we've been adjusting that meeting schedule that the board decided on what the meeting schedule was going to be. And we've had to adjust one of those meeting dates because we weren't able to get the quorum because of the resignation and other board members due to personal circumstances weren't able to attend that day. So we've rescheduled that and hopefully that'll be a go. And I can run down several of these things too. Again, this is all in the one pager. I think the big thing that I want to highlight here is we're in the process of working on and going to take to the board in March, the first round of guidance to put out. We don't want to put guidance out without board input. And really the crux of a lot of what's here is so much of what was called for in the recommendations was in consultation with the dyslexia board. And I do want to note too and to clarify the comments for us around prioritizing recommendations is a matter of the order in which we pursue work on those and what it looks like. Right? Because there are a lot of recommendations in there, and as noted, it's a volunteer citizen board, and we want to be mindful and respectful of everyone's time as well as our own staff's time. So the prioritization is looking at the recommendations and figuring out what order we want to work on addressing those. And depending on how those conversations turn out, again, we want to do that in collaboration with the Iowa Dyslexia Board. So with that, I think I'll pause and just see what questions folks have about the work we're doing around dyslexia.
First, just a comment. Number 2 item under your list here on legislation requirements. You might want to look at that because there's misused words in there that you might want to look at. So,
okay, and any specific?
Well, for example, it says subject to an appropriate. That should be appropriation, I'm sure.
Right, yeah.
And 2 sentences down, it should be appropriated. My question would be, at this point, based on these recommendations, not legislation, has the department Any determination if any of these are outside the department's obligations at this point?
No, I mean, I think what's clear is what's in code, but in terms of whether or not it's reasonable to be within our purview to pursue, we haven't ruled any of those things out.
Okay.
Many of us got emails, parents, educators.
Sure.
One question that occurred to me was kind of and I'm not minimizing parental concern, but the educators seem to want some practical sort of advice or support about what to do in the classroom.
Absolutely.
And that is, can you explain what will happen in that regard?
Sure. So there's probably at least two things to think about there. One is, and it's in the recommendations, specifically around offering guidance around what practice can and should look like for students with dyslexia. And so there are opportunities for us to provide multiple rounds of guidance. We have to be mindful at any one time of, we don't want a really long, detailed on one spot list of guidance. So we want to think about how we push that out to the field. But one is delivering written guidance. And that's not unique to dyslexia. We do that for a whole host of things. The second would be more in the realm of professional learning, training sorts of things. And that's where we partner with pre-service, like the Iowa Reading Research Center. We can produce some of that here at the department directly, but we also partner with our AEAs. That's one reason why they're required to have at least one staff member with designated expertise in dyslexia, is so that they are engaged in the provision of professional learning and training too, which we partner with them to provide. So that takes lots of forms, right? That can be on the ground coaching, that can be online videos, consultation. There are multiple formats for providing that. And we would be working with the Dyslexia Board for their input on what they think that should look like and what it should contain, and in partnership with the AEAs to deliver that. One thing that I think is advantageous in a challenging situation here is a lot of the assessment and instructional practices that research is clear on that are effective for students with dyslexia are also effective for students that struggle to learn how to read but aren't diagnosed with dyslexia. And the reason why I say that's advantageous to us is we don't have to try to build capacity onto totally separate ways of helping struggling learners. There's a unified set of practices that can be helpful for students that are struggling to read. That doesn't mean that we aren't attendant to and recognize students with dyslexia. Part of what we think about with guidance is there's a lot of misunderstanding about what dyslexia means and what you can and can't talk about in schools regarding dyslexia. We do want to provide some clarity around that. So we're attendant to the unique needs of students with dyslexia and their families. But we'd be partnering with the AEAs around what evidence-based practices for struggling readers really looks like, and that casts an even wider net of effectiveness for us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, Brad. This is an issue that has been around for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Did it take the legislature to force us to respond to this, the AEAs as well? Has there been a lot of diagnostic work going on in the AEAs and in schools in Iowa, regardless of what the Department of Ed or anyone else has done?
Good question. And I'll note too, I wasn't privy to all the earlier conversations because I came on board a little bit later. With that being said, there isn't a lot of diagnostic work done. There isn't diagnostic work done in schools related to dyslexia because it's not in the school's purview or licensure to be able to diagnose dyslexia. I think what's at issue here is when students are diagnosed with dyslexia by community-based providers, for example, how do schools and AEAs for that matter, when that information is brought to the table, report, for example, a diagnostic report with intervention recommendations, how does that information come in and how is it used? either just to inform interventions or whether or not students need a 504 plan or an IEP. And I think that's probably where we can provide help and clarity around what the law says can and can't be discussed around dyslexia in schools and how that information should be used.
Yeah, so the majority of school districts or 300 school districts or whatever asking you for that kind of information? Have they asked you? Is there a push on the public's side to really delve into this issue?
Sure. We certainly hear some. I invite Kathy to weigh in, but she has even more conversations with AEA personnel, for example.
Yeah, I would say as part of the task force report, they collected a wide survey from educators at all ranges, from teachers through administrators. And right now, there's a lot of need for understanding what dyslexia is, what the characteristics are, what it is, what it isn't, how to talk about it, because that's kind of the open door to having a conversation about then what does that look like in schools. And so I'd say that's almost like the first place, right? That's almost a barrier at this point to having conversations that impact students and families and such. And if we can have those conversations, then we can get to the instruction, right, that students need. But overwhelmingly, that survey report, which I think you can find most of the summaries of that in that task force report, but that survey really said that educators need more information, which is why the legislation has that recommendation or the requirement for educators to engage in that overview module, which really talks about those characteristics. But we're also not at capacity on completing that overview module either. It's just a piece of that progress towards that work.
I think my frustration will be the parental frustration, and that is how long it takes to respond to a parent needs and what are, I think, fairly general needs in all school districts. I appreciate the work you're doing. I'm not being overly critical. I'm just saying, darn it, it takes too long to respond to what should have been done when I was teaching 20 years ago. You know, we were still dealing with these issues, but thanks for your work.
No, and I think that's a fair point, Mike. And there's always an interplay between policy, legislation, other stakeholder groups, what department AEAs and schools are doing. And I appreciate the frustration that some families and educators have around this space. And it certainly is a priority for the department. And we're working towards that here now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any idea as far as the percent of students who are dyslexic?
Yeah, you know, it's dependent on the diagnostic process, and sometimes that can range from 5 to 20%. So it's really dependent on that. And many of those students are also screened out as part of our early literacy screening, right? So that we identify those as part of those students as part of our early literacy K-3 screening as well. So there's an overlap in the students who are identified through early screening for at-risk reading and those students with dyslexia as well. But it's somewhere 5 to 20%. I know that's a broad range, but it's depending on the resources that you have.
Do you feel that students are under-identified possibly?
I don't know if I can really speak to that. I mean, when we think about students with disabilities, students with academic disabilities are our highest area of category of need, and we have about 15% of students with disabilities in the state. So I don't know what percentage of students with dyslexia are in our schools per se.
And so sorry, Betty, just to follow up on Kathy's point, that's one of the reasons why having an early warning system or a screening system is really important. And that's part of what's in the early literacy implementation law, which preceded the laws around dyslexia that we're talking about now. It's going to cast a wide net and identify students that are struggling to learn how to read. And they may be diagnosed with a learning disability, dyslexia. They may be diagnosed as or identified as needing special education services or not. But those assessments are sensitive to identifying which students are struggling, regardless of which particular category they would fit into, so that we can intervene early. So to Kathy's point, I don't know if it's underdiagnosed, but having an early warning system that identifies struggling readers early helps us intervene early. That's why we invest so heavily in the MTSS work. Everybody around.
Who can diagnose dyslexia?
Sure. So there are psychologists, speech language pathologists. Are there any other like diagnostic?
Primarily, that would be it.
Those are the-
Physicians could.
Physicians could too. But those are all folks that are licensed, not within what the Board of Educational Examiners would license around for educational license. Those are a different category of.
So there may be people at the AEA.
They might, but that wouldn't necessarily be in the purview of what they're doing at the AEA. Like if they've got that license, that's fine, but their job wouldn't be to diagnose dyslexia.
So Brett, what you're saying long-term is that as we do diagnostic work in the classroom, we should be able to catch this now, where before maybe we got passed over that, right? And so that would be the goal, that this would be added to that collection of things that we're concerned about.
Absolutely. So between that early warning system that I was talking about, the universal screening that we talk about, and trying to provide clarity around what is and isn't in bounds in terms of taking diagnostic information from a psychologist or a speech language pathologist working in the community or a physician, and how that information can be used to inform either just instructional decisions in the school or decisions around a 504 plan or an IEP. I think that's an area of growth that we can move into that'll be really helpful for our districts and our teachers. Is here's how you can use that information. You can give it weight, and here's how you can use that information to inform your decisions.
Maybe this is a naive question, but why does it have to be diagnosed before we can talk about it in schools and intervene? Why is it a condition that needs an official diagnosis?
Sure. So my experience is that dyslexia, not new, Mike, as you referred to earlier, at all. And I think my observation has been is a lot of times families and children with dyslexia have had to fight really hard because their instructional needs are there and the implications are profound. And so by advocating for the diagnosis, I think it creates something real, because it names it, and it gives it credibility and credence to know that this is important. We need to address it. Now, with that being said, and the importance of that, the approach that is laid out in the education system in Iowa is, regardless of whether or not it's diagnosed or not, whether or not it ends up a student needing special education services or 504 plan or not, struggling readers by and large, and you can see this from a lot of the brain research too, the brain behaves in very similar ways regardless of the diagnosis. And the things that we do in response to it are mostly the same. So to your point, the school systems and the AEA shouldn't need the diagnosis to address the implication that happens in instruction, right? So the diagnosis should not be necessary for it from a purely, here's how you assess and here's how you teach and help. With that being said, I think the advocacy is really important because the needs are real. And I think part of what you've heard in emails and here is that there continues to be frustration because needs aren't being met. And so on one sense, it's probably not needed to help, but on the other sense, advocacy is a critically important aspect of public education.
It is. It just seems like it puts a barrier for parents. You got to go out and find a psychologist to diagnose your kid, which may or may not be readily available in rural Iowa.
Right, sure.
Someone with that expertise. It just seems like a barrier that is really not creating advocacy, maybe.
Sure.
Creating more barrier.
Sure. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Betty. And I think my reflection would be the reason why we invest so heavily in MTSS and why there's an early literacy implementation law is we should be able to help with or without the diagnosis instructionally.
Yeah, the fact is, if you can't read, you can't read, no matter what it. Now, there might be different ways to deal with that, but
right.
When do these universal screenings occur?
3 times a year. They have fall, winter, spring, basically.
But I mean, what age are the students?
It starts in kindergarten.
Okay,
right away.
All right.
Yeah. So within the first really month of school, all kindergartners in the state should be engaged with that universal screening process.
Is there any thought to starting that in preschool?
Yes, there is. It's not part of the early literacy implementation law, but we have supported the AEAs at times and us at times. It's ebbed and flowed a little bit over the years, but we support universal screening at the preschool level as well. It's just not required. And so the whole other conversation about preschool and how many students are there. And I mean, it's a good conversation too, but I think from a research-based perspective, universal screening in preschool is critically important. There are things we know we can do early on. So no, we've supported that with the implementation of the early literacy implementation law.
A couple things. One, we'll be hearing from Council Bluffs Early Learning Center.
Yeah.
Are they doing the screening there?
At the kindergarten level or the preschool
level?
Yeah, so that's part of the agreement that's set up there, is that they would be engaged in universal screening work. Literacy.
Yeah, the other comment I have is I do like your big idea to prioritize the recommendations. I know that I'm assuming there's more than one task force at work right now that the department is working with.
We do have probably more than one task force going on right now. So yes.
And I know that being part of task force, those recommendations are really heartfelt and really want to move forward. But I do like the ideas to prioritize what can be done and what makes sense as far as everything is important, but when everything is important, then it's hard to get everything done.
Yeah. And that's I think that's where we're at right now, is just working collaboratively with the board. And the department was a voting member on that task force. So it's not that we don't support the recommendations.
Right.
We want to move forward together with the structure that we have and the resources that are available.
To your point, John, I think we shared this maybe 2 years ago. I'm kind of looking at Shan. We did an internal assessment of the director's work and the work of the department. And just for the director, there's close to 30 positions I'm appointed to serve on. And for the department as a whole, it was over 300.
So you multiply all those recommendations coming in.
Yes.
Sure. When would it be appropriate for us to review how things are today versus a quarter from now, a half a year from now? I mean,
sure,
we're probably still going to get questions and input, and I welcome that. But
so as a point of reference for whatever decision you make on that, out of the gate, the board decided to meet quarterly. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't work in between or that the board doesn't revisit that and decide to meet more frequently. But as a point of reference for your decision, that's what the board decided to date.
And the next meeting is when?
It's scheduled for March 30th. Okay. Fingers crossed.
So potentially, even at our next state board meeting, there could be an initial update on that meeting, because I think that was the meeting where there would be conversation on guidance, and that was the meeting that's being held because the other one was delayed. So that might be the most immediate point of reference.
I'd like
That'd be
to
nice.
ask that we do that.
Let's have that on the agenda for.
Okay.
If we can.
I have a question. If a student is, well, I guess, I don't know if it wouldn't be a diagnosis right in the school, but if a teacher said, maybe thinks that they need to be screened, I guess, for dyslexia, how does that communicate to the parents? And then are the parents, it's not just like go see your family practitioner or something like that. I mean, it's, you have to go find someone, or, is that, like how, is it like a sit down conversation? I mean, how do the parents find out about it? Are there resources? Here's some people you can talk to, especially in smaller communities where there might not be a lot of people. How is that process kind of rolled out to the parent? Because that might be kind of, maybe the parent didn't know. It could be, I know, with my child, we recently went through something where, in preschool, they've been watching him over the last year, and, his writing and coloring and things aren't where it needs to be. And I know it doesn't sound like a huge deal, but fine motor skills. And I was like about to cry, in the meeting, because I'm like, it's your child, and there's, you feel like helpless. Right. And so they were like, you should probably go talk to an occupational therapist, get him to see, whatever. And it was extremely helpful, because going and sitting down for the evaluation, and, we have exercises that we do at home every single night, and, everything like that. And we're going to see her every 2 weeks. But I mean, I've seen there like, I mean, you know, like you don't, your child is perfect in your eyes, of course, but I mean, they're not, right now. So like when there's something wrong, you're just like, so I just don't know, how is that?
Chinese problem.
Like your child has dyslexia, that might be like, I mean, I'd be like, you know, so.
Especially that early on in a child's development, to hear news like that can stop you in your tracks for sure.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk at all about?
Yeah, you know, I'm a school psychologist by training and worked in elementary quite a bit, right? And I would hope that the first conversation a teacher has with a parent about their child's any sort of concern that is developing, right? Isn't the conversation that is about a diagnosis, right? Like the first one should be like, hey, this is a little bit behind. We're going to start working on this. But if it is concerning enough that it's interfering with education, there are some real specific requirements that schools are need to do that are required by law. They, like, for example, if the concern is impacting their education, they would need to make a recommendation for a referral for additional services for special education perhaps, or 504 perhaps. And so those are things that we can do at school, right? That aren't necessarily through an outside provider. But again, I would hope that would be after some conversations about, you know, how is the child doing at school and how are they developing in general in regards to any of their academic and or developmental milestones, right? And it shouldn't be a surprise to a family member, right? When there's one of those concerns that pop up. But it's sort of a gradual process, right? But I think one thing that you note is that what kind of resources do families need to better understand early reading concerns and dyslexia, and maybe those are some resources we should be thinking about as well in communicating with families also, so that we're all working on it as early as possible in prevention. And then is there anything else that you?
I agree with you, Kathy.
I appreciate the discussion. I really do. I know we're going over, Brooke, and I apologize for 2 or 3 questions here, but it occurs to me too, Larry, that when we hire a new teacher in Iowa, the elementary level, that they should be ready to go in diagnosing reading issues. Is that fair? Is that fair to say? I mean,
it's not actually. They're
well, it should.
Every
I'm saying.
We're talking about diagnosing, and an elementary teacher is not prepared. I mean, you know, we just talked about that's a school psychologist. That's a master's level.
Okay.
Above and beyond.
So it's too much to expect.
It's way too much to expect. Okay. However, the elementary teacher, every elementary teacher is required. First of all, they're required to receive training in working with students who have dyslexia, and they're required to do training with Iowa Reading Research Center. So they're already doing those pieces with the intent that they can better meet the needs of a student with dyslexia. Now, the thing is, this is why you just approved about 1.5 years ago the dyslexia specialist programs at University of Iowa, at the same time that the Board of Educational Examiners approved the dyslexia specialist endorsement. And that's running. First cohort, about 25 of them finish in December. We're starting now to the approval process for other colleges to add those. So those are going to be the people that can really meet the needs and then can provide the strategies and support for those general classroom teachers that have knowledge of meeting the needs of dyslexia. But 1,800 elementary teachers every year are not going to be dyslexia specialists. No, sir.
It don't have to be a doctor though to know when there's a problem. When someone has a problem. Yeah, I mean, if I'm diagnosing, I know there's an issue. I know there's a problem. Right. Then I talk to a psychologist about that as a teacher,
or they'll and the idea is that they'll know there's a problem, and based on what they've learned and know, then they're going to say, hey, look, it looks like this child may be dyslexic. Let me take it to the next level. And they're going to take it to that dyslexia specialist who's going to get the right people, because diagnosis is a whole lot different than teaching.
Thank you.
If I can hop in here, I think I just want to reiterate Mike May's comments earlier of the importance of doing this quickly and promptly. I think that it's already been delayed a little bit too long. This problem didn't stop while the pandemic was at full swing. So while I understand John Robbins' comments about prioritizing that, I think that is super important. And I understand that Director Lieber's comments about having 300 or more recommendations. I think it's really important to look at the recommendations that the Iowa Dyslexia Task Force gave to the Department of Education and that we're seeing here on the board today. There's only 8 that are department specific. And I think that what I've been hearing from people who were on the original task force is that the original communication was, even if they weren't written into code, a lot of times they weren't written into the code because the department had said that they could do this promptly and quickly without that and voluntarily. So I think that it's really important to move forward not only on the ones written into code, but the ones not, and focusing on those 8 recommendations that they gave specifically to the Department of Education is extremely important, because this is a time where students are learning to read. They're trying to decide if they are a reader or if they aren't a reader. And I think that deciding that you aren't a reader is something that is very impactful on your education in the future. You're not willing to raise your hand in class to read off the paper. And I see that in high schoolers right now who struggle to read when they were in elementary school. So I think focusing on these 8 recommendations is something that needs to be done right away. But then in collaboration with the Dyslexia Board and the Department of Education, I think you also need to work with students who have dyslexia as well to get their input on it. Because just to make sure that while the experts are giving the recommendations, that they align with what students with dyslexia really need. So prioritize the actual recommendations, the 8 ones from here, and try to involve students with dyslexia in the solution.
Thanks, Hannah. Point well taken too on making sure to include student voice in their personal experience in anything that we're doing here. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Brad? Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Sandra Klein. I'm here to talk about the School Budget Review Committee that met on January 25th, 2022 for a special hearing.
And actually, Cassandra, do they know your new position?
Oh, I'm still the School Budget Review Committee liaison. I'm also now the Bureau Chief for the Bureau of School Business Operations.
So she's Tom Cooley.
Oh, congratulations.
Point of
Tom.
contact.
More hair.
Sounds like a really
Are
good job.
you going to be doing?
Congratulations.
Are you going to be doing both?
Yeah, I mean, that's the job. She just still serves as the liaison. She'll continue as both, yes.
Oh, okay.
I just, at the last meeting at the SBRC, I remembered I forgot to mention that. So I wanted to make sure that the board knew.
Congratulations.
So as a special hearing, this hearing is actually pretty short. So just a few items, information items that were provided. The first one is an Aea follow-up. So at the December hearing, there were some questions about low carry forward balances for 2 AEAs, specifically with their special education balances. So as a follow-up, the committee asked those 2 AEAs to provide a letter of explanation and really share some of the best practices and what they're doing to maintain the low carry forward balances in their special education balances. So that information was provided to the committee. Also at the December hearing, the committee took action to approve 9 corrective action plans for districts that had filed late fiscal reports. 2 of those were approved with reservations, which required additional action on the part of those 2 districts. Those 2 districts did fulfill the additional stipulations. And so the information was provided to the SBRC and those districts were completely approved.
What type of additional information in general were you asked them to provide?
Sure. So a part of the corrective action plan, they have to provide steps that they will take in the following year to ensure that the late filing does not occur again. And so part of what we look for is a timeline of when those events will happen. So one of the timelines that was provided, we didn't think would actually support timely filing. And so we asked for an update to that. And the other one was missing a timeline. And so they added a timeline.
Okay. Then another question while you're on that is 9 a typical number of school districts, or is that?
It's not actually. So about 2014, when the SBO authorization was approved, the field went from double-digit numbers every year to single-digit numbers every year for late fiscal filing. And we've seen those actually drop down to 0, where we actually had a year where there was only one late fiscal filing, and it was an AEA, not even a school district. The year prior to 21, in 20, there were I think 2. This year, the 9, we think, was a result of the pandemic. Going through each of the corrective action plans myself, there was a general trend. So whether it was the school business official themselves were out with COVID, they had lost staff due to COVID. The other people that help with it were out due to COVID during the 3 or 4 weeks that the district was working on it, or staffing was just, they were unable to fill staffing positions because of general staffing issues, they think related to the pandemic. So there was kind of that general trend that we hope will not be seen again in the coming year.
Thank you.
Yes. So the purpose of the special hearing, though, was to receive fiscal updates from 4 districts. At the October annual hearing or annual work session, the district determined, as part of a response to what more could be done prior to a district incurring a negative unspent balance, they determined that they would have a check-in with districts. So the check-in is calculation is this: if a district would have incurred a negative unspent balance if the categorical balances were removed, then those districts were required to provide a fiscal update. So we had 4 districts that were required to appear. Each of them appeared, each of them provided the fiscal update, and and all 4 of them had a very different story to tell, a very different path forward, and a very different look at what was to come and how they were going to meet those requirements. Each of the districts did appear and provide all of the information that was requested. One additional update that I would share with you is there is a membership change coming for the SPRC. So each of the terms that the public members serve are 3 years in length. So Lee Tack, who has been serving for 6 terms, has just been reappointed for his 7th term. Mary Jo Hainstock, she was a retired superintendent from Benton-Schellsburg. She'll complete her term on April 30th. And Patty Schrader will begin her term on May 1st. Patty Schrader, some of you may know her. She has worked at the Department of Management. She was a retired school business official from Des Moines Public Schools. She worked for the auditor's office, and most recently she retired from the Iowa Association of School Boards. Any other questions?
Is there like a waiver process or an extension for the deadline? So if 9 districts are kind of blowing past the deadline, and I can understand, with COVID, maybe people being could they have requested a waiver, or is something like that in place, an extension they could have?
We do. We have in rule what we call good cause. So anything that has good cause. So usually it's something beyond the district's control, such as like a hospitalization or a death or something like that. There's a time period in which it can be requested also. So not earlier than 2 weeks prior to the deadline, and not sooner than 3 days prior to the deadline. So it's an effort to say, this is something, it's big, it's something we're not going to be able to address, but not something that for a district that waits until the last minute to actually to ask for it. And we actually did have, I think, 6 districts that requested extensions. I can get the right numbers, 5 or 6, and only one of those ended up still being late. So they weren't even included in the count of 9. So those 9 that were considered late actually either didn't request the extension or still requested the extension, but filed after the approved extension date.
Okay. Thank you.
Cassandra, my concern would be that we never get into that situation again where we have a school in eastern Iowa. Budget get into a big mess. I don't want to be a part of that again. So I appreciate your work and making known to us any circumstances that we have to address early on. Thank you.
Thank you. Quick break.
Oh, okay.
Council Bluffs is on the agenda next, I believe. Are they here in person?
Yes. they
So
are.
it might be okay, just take a quick 5-minute break, let them come in and get set up, and we'll come back at 10:26. David, we're going to adjourn until 10:26.